From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. When you hear or read discussions about homelessness, do you ever picture a small child bundled up and asleep on the sidewalk? Probably not. But advocates are sounding the alarm with numbers showing a startling increase in child homelessness just in the past few years. More than 20% of Toronto's homeless population is made up of children, nearly doubled in number from just 4 years ago. There are currently thousands of children living in shelters across Toronto, and nearly 70% of them are younger than 10. And these official numbers don't include kids living in shelters for abused women or those who might be spending every night on a different couch, a different reality out of the shelter system. What are the complexities of child homelessness the city is grappling with? Why have the numbers spiked? And has the pandemic made it worse for children who are growing up without the security of a home? That should be every child's basic right. The Star's affordable housing reporter Victoria Gibson spent time with some families in the system to understand the realities of child and family homelessness as the city battles a health crisis. And she's here with me today. Hi, Victoria. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Anytime.
So I want to start with the story that you're working on. When we think about a homeless person, it's hard for us to imagine a child in that situation. We don't automatically visualize that. And yet you're finding that the numbers tell a different story, don't they?
Absolutely. You know, when I was researching this story, I came across this 2016 report from an organization called Raising the Roof, which works on homeless prevention. And they were pointing out that the prevailing image at that point of homelessness in Canada seemed to be an older single man, maybe sitting on a street corner, and that most of the research that we had at that point focused on adults or on youth. But what we're seeing in this story is that a sizable chunk of Toronto shelter occupants, 20% before the pandemic hit and about 17% as of last month, were actually kids, and around 70% of them were 10 years old or younger.
And these numbers are quite high, and they seem to be increasing. Is it the pandemic that has amplified the situation? What's going on here?
You know, there are a lot of factors at play here, and every situation is unique. But one of the trends that's contributed to the spike that we saw, particularly in 2018, when numbers of kids in shelters went above 2,000, was the influx that we've seen of migrant families coming to Canada and to Toronto specifically as a large urban center. But they find a housing market that for a lot of families just isn't affordable. So the conversation around housing refugees and asylum seekers was really big at the time. But the feeling that some of the folks I spoke to for this story was that in all the negotiating about what level of government would foot the cost, who was responsible, what got lost was that so many of these shelter residents, these homeless individuals, were actually kids. And the numbers have come down since the sort of height of that crisis when we did have 2,000 kids in the shelter system, but they were still floating around the 1,500 mark before the pandemic hit, which is a lot worse than what we were saying in, say, early 2016 when that number was in the 400 range. So the pandemic's actually eased a little bit of the pressure because fewer new migrant families are entering the shelter system with the border restrictions in place because of the virus.
And you're talking about that time an influx of migrant families and newcomers, and on top of the barriers that they might have to face in terms of the displacement coming to an entirely new country, trying to find a sense of belonging there, being a part of the shelter system must heighten those challenges and that sense of confusion and disorientation, correct?
Yeah, you know, the whole question about stability and whether kids in the shelter system can have stability was a theme of some of the interviews that I was doing with social service workers for this story. And parents that I talked to went to really great extents to try and give their kids some semblance of stability. You know, not necessarily when we're talking about these asylum-seeking families, but, you know, there were parents that kept their kids in the schools in their old neighborhoods and took a city bus with them across the city in the morning to keep some things in their lives from being uprooted when they had to move into the shelters. And this whole idea of stability boils down to the fact that it can't be easy to uproot your life and know that you're going to have to do it again in the near future. And for those who do move schools, it's not like they can invite friends over to play inside the shelter. That's not how the system works. So it is really tough, and particularly for kids when their lives are uprooted like that.
And I want to go into a little bit more detail on that front. I know you spoke to a number of families. You've looked into what these children's lives are like. What does life look like for a child living in a shelter? What are the constricting factors that they have to contend with living in this uncertain situation?
Definitely. Well, all of these situations were very different. But one of the things that stood out to me the most about what life looks like for these kids is lack of privacy that they have right now. With one of the families I talked to, 4 of them were living in one room with 2 beds. And the pandemic lockdown was hard enough on all of us, let alone being in this kind of living arrangement. One mom that I spoke to, she has 1-year-old twins and a 6-year-old son. She pointed out that when her babies took a nap, her and her son had to just sit in the dark in the room with them because they couldn't go anywhere. And, on the flip side, I heard about how difficult it was to keep kids away from their friends when distance guidelines were put in place. What do you do when you live in a building with more than 100 kids and they're just outside your child's door? How do you keep them away? And what do you do if the kitchen where you prepare your meals is outside of that room and they have to be around other kids? I know some of Toronto's family shelters had outbreaks of the coronavirus, and I imagine that was quite frightening as a parent living in this kind of congregate setting and trying to keep your kids safe.
Right. So in a way, COVID-19 added to these stressful factors for both parents and their children.
Mm-hmm. And, e-learning was a whole other conversation because a lot of these shelters, the rooms that families are in, they don't have internet connections. Families everywhere were struggling with e-learning this spring. One of these moms in the shelters told me she bought a limited internet connection to keep her 8-year-old connected to his classes, but another said they just couldn't make it work. That's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. I was told about kids who fought more with their siblings, stopped listening to the rules that their parents were trying to impose because of the emotional reaction of moving into the shelter. I spoke to a 17-year-old girl who told me she was stressed because she didn't know what she wanted to do after high school, but she just had so many other things to think about, like where her family would live in a year, that fell to the wayside. So it's a real mixed bag of impacts on kids, but it's definitely something that is seen broadly across the sector.
So in terms of education, Victoria, you're mentioning some of these challenges during COVID in terms of e-learning and online access. But for many of these kids, they must have been going to school before the pandemic. And for many of them, this must have been, in a way, the only tie to stability, to normalcy, to a regular life. And now that's been affected, right?
Mm-hmm. And the big thing with lockdown is just that these shelters go from being a part of these kids' days to their entire day. I talked to kids who sometimes got a break from the shelter by sleeping over at a relative's house. But shelter workers pointed out that for a lot of these kids, school is that break. It's that place where they got a little bit of respite from the shelter and from sharing a room with their parents and all of their siblings. And when COVID hit, that just stopped.
I want to take a look at the larger picture here. How does someone trying to survive and just look out for their kids, like any of us, end up falling through the cracks and in a shelter? What are the factors behind this?
It depends on the individual circumstance, but I can give you some examples. One mother I spoke with, the mom who has twins and a 6-year-old son, she came here to Canada several years ago from Brazil. She wanted to give her son a better life. She told me she'd been a physiotherapist when she was in Brazil, spent a lot of time getting qualified for that, and she hoped to get her qualifications to work in the same field here. But then she found out she was pregnant with twins in a country where she didn't have any family around to help her. And she ended up in the shelter a month after they were born, with her then 5-year-old along with her. Another family that I spoke to told me they'd been on the wait list for Toronto community housing for 8 years now, and they've struggled to find housing in the private market because of issues with credit, their low income status, the size of their family. So it really can be any combination of circumstances that brings people into these living situations. And the question for all of them is, how do they get out?
So you've been speaking about the psychological, the emotional effects here, and you're talking about this huge number of very young kids in this situation. In terms of long-term effects, what could be the impact of growing up like this for a child at such a critical age?
Well, one thing that the city has recognized even is that homelessness can be cyclical. So kids that are living in the shelter system are actually at a higher risk of becoming homeless later in their lives. And that's supported by data that the city's collected. They did a one-night survey of its homeless population a couple of years ago. It's called the Street Needs Assessment. And out of everybody they surveyed that night of any age, a third of the respondents said that their first experience with homelessness was when they were a kid themselves. And that's not to say it happens for everybody, but it is the trend that we've seen in Toronto. And some of the parents that I talked to said that they hoped being in the shelter actually gave their kids a better chance to have a good life, with the thought that it was a place that they could go and get support and have a housing worker work with them to try and find somewhere that they could afford to stay in the long term, so their kids could have that stability that we talked about, so that their kids could study and focus on school without having to worry about their family situation, and so they could thrive later on in life. So a lot of these parents really have high hopes for their kids, but the sort of cyclical nature of homelessness sometimes is a risk that you see when it comes to these kids, and one that when the city is striving to bring homelessness to a point where it is sort of short and non-recurring, that's very contrary to their overall goals.
And are we talking about very young children here? What is the age group of the majority of the children that are experiencing homelessness and are in the shelter system?
Absolutely, we're talking about young kids. And that was something that actually initially drew me to this story when I got a hold of this data, because it's something that I didn't personally know about. These kids, around 70% of them, it fluctuates month by month, but around 70% generally are under the age of 10. In July, that meant more than 350 kids between 5 and 10, another more than 250 that were between 1 and 4, 82 children that were under 1 year old. There are a lot of kids in this system who are extremely young and who are, in daycare or elementary school. These aren't kids that even in some cases know necessarily what's going on. One of the things that stood out to me, I was speaking to an 8-year-old boy named Eli, and he told me that he liked living in the shelter because he got to play with his friends all the time. Another 6-year-old, said that this was the best house he's ever had because he has his friends around all the time. So it is a situation that it depends on the kid, and kids are surprisingly resilient. But older kids, as they sort of get into their preteen years, sort of recognize that being there, especially in the long term, can wear on you. And some of these families have been in these shelters for more than a year. So it's not a short-term temporary fix for some of them. It's their day-to-day reality.
And you mentioned kids are resilient, but as they continue to grow in this sort of uncertain circumstances, what kind of impact does it have on their mental health? Did you speak to anybody about the sort of mental health issues that might come up as a result of this, or they might be facing?
I definitely heard about mental health challenges, not just with the kids, but with their parents, as they're sort of struggling with the precarity of their circumstances and not knowing what happens next, and, being rejected for rental places and waiting on wait lists that take years and years and years. And as I mentioned before, I spoke to a 17-year-old girl who was very aware that the situation with her family's housing was sort of an acute stressor in her life, and something that took priority over thinking about her own future and her own education, because it is sort of a more pressing day-to-day need for her family right now.
In terms of policy, what is the city doing to get these kids and their families out of these shelters and into permanent housing?
When I spoke to the city for this story, I was speaking with the Shelter Support and Housing Administration, and they're also concerned by the rise in family homelessness and the rise in homelessness in general that we've seen over the past couple of years. And this sort of goes two ways. The only solution that the city sees for families that are currently homeless is to give them permanent housing, which is a difficult task. But diverting families from entering the system in the first place is a whole other question. And that's one that the city thinks will involve looking at processes like evictions and systems from child welfare to education, and how those all might contribute to pathways to homelessness. The city does have a housing action plan right now. It's relatively new, that aims to increase supportive and affordable housing over the coming years. And they have promised as part of that to develop interventions for groups with specific needs, and youth are one of them, as well as populations like seniors and refugees and newcomers. So we will see what happens there. But there are folks who think that they're not doing enough. I was speaking with street nurse Kathy Crow, who was involved in a documentary project about homeless kids about a decade ago. And she's pressing the city to develop an approach that's more specific to tackle the rise in child homelessness that we've been seeing over the past couple of years.
And have you spoken to other advocates about this? Are we having enough of a conversation around this issue, about the rise in numbers of just the children in this situation?
It's not really my place to say whether we're talking about something enough, but some of the people I spoke to for this story think, no, we really aren't. And I think that's because, again, it's not the image that people think about when it comes to homelessness in Toronto. These are kids that are getting up every day, they're going to school, and you might be none the wiser if you saw them what their living situation is. I was speaking to Steve Marr, who manages a shelter for refugee families in sort of the west end of Toronto. And he was talking about migrant families and the fact that so rarely do you hear specifically policies or efforts around getting these children housed. It's sort of talking about them as a group. And he was saying, he thinks if we saw these kids, as opposed to just seeing them as part of sort of the broader issue of where to house migrant families, that officials would be compelled to do more to support them and to move them out of homelessness into permanent housing. It's, again, not my place to say whether we're talking about this enough, but ultimately advocates are saying that there is definitely room for this conversation to grow and for it to take a more prevalent place in sort of political discourse.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Victoria.
My pleasure.
That was the Star's affordable housing reporter, Victoria Gibson. If you want to read more about this, her in-depth story will be coming out on Saturday, and you can read it on star.com. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Munter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.